We're very happy to have Michael Lind with us today, visiting professor at the LBJ School of Government, University of Texas. And he just told me on the way here he has a new book coming out in the fall called The New Class War. Is that right? So we're going to give Michael a little bit longer than usual because I think we could all use a bit of American economic history as it relates to some of the debates and discussions we've been having in the class. So I think that's going to set the stage perfectly for our usual discussion afterwards. So Michael, thanks again. And
Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Great. Well, this class is extremely fortunate to have these two scholars teaching you. They didn't tell me to say that. And it's a great opportunity for me, to share some of their time with you today. I was asked to talk about the developmental state, particularly in the United States context. The term developmental state was used by American scholars like Meredith Cummings Wu and Chalmers Johnson in the 1990s. But the actual institution, the practice, goes back to the Renaissance, if not to the ancient world. That is, city-states, kingdoms, nation-states, marshaling various tools, thank you, to promote economic and industrial development. And as we'll see, I'll go through these slides briefly, the United States has always had a developmental state of some sort, even though the term has only recently been used. And I use the term American systems, plural, because Henry Clay, whom we'll meet in a moment, used the term the American system for the first kind of comprehensive, integrated developmental plan. But I argue we've had several historic American systems, beginning with the one envisioned by Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary before he became a Broadway star. From his report on manufactures in 1791, when he was with the Washington administration, there is no purpose to which public money can be more beneficially applied than to the acquisition of a new and useful branch of industry. No consideration more valuable than a permanent addition to the general stock of productive labor. Now, Hamilton, as brilliant as he was, did not invent any of this. When he was one of General Washington's chief aides during the Revolutionary War, he lugged about with him Malachi Postlethwaite's Universal Dictionary of Commerce and Trade, and learned the system of mercantilism, the developmental state of the day, that had been used in 18th and 17th century France and Britain. The Postlethwaite book was a translation of a French original from a minister of Louis XIV with modifications and additions like a textbook. In advance of this class, I thought, well, I've referred to Postlethwaite's book. I never actually owned a facsimile copy, so I'll bring one and show the students. So I ordered it, came last week to the post office in a box too big to put in my little P.O. box. So each one of the facsimiles is about 3 feet by 1 feet, 800 pages, weighs about 40 pounds. So I did not bring it on the airplane. But so there were models for the United States, which went back centuries, for this kind of developmentalism. So these are what I call the 3 pillars of the early American developmental state, 2 of them associated with Hamilton, and one with Albert Gallatin, the Swiss-born Treasury Secretary for President Thomas Jefferson. The first was government-sponsored manufacturing. Hamilton, in his report on manufactures, called for what nowadays is known as ISI, import substitution industrialization, and particularly with militarily relevant industries. Because working with General Washington during the Revolutionary War, the US was almost entirely dependent on military supplies from France, the ally of the rebellious colonists. And in order to get out of that situation of dependency, the Washington administration wanted to have a government-sponsored industrial base in the US that could supply not only iron, steel, but also things like hemp for ropes, for military purposes, because at that time, the British Empire remained the major geopolitical rival of the US up until about the middle of the 19th century, and we subsequently fought wars with them in 1812. And there was also a quasi-war with France, my favorite quasi-war, in 1798. So you have to think of Hamilton, who's thought of as the founder of Wall Street in many circles, as a kind of Latin American colonel. He's a military officer, a military nationalist who wants import substitution so that the British and the French can't kick this ex-colonial country around. So you have government sponsored manufacturing. Hamilton, interestingly for the economists in the room, thought that bounties or subsidies were more efficient than tariffs. He's associated with tariffs, but he said tariffs fall entirely on particular consumers, whereas the subsidies, the bounties, can be spread out over the whole population. Subsequent iterations of this Hamiltonian system tended to rely on tariffs for political reasons. It was easier to do that than to get government appropriations going to specific industries. So a national banking system. He was the architect of the first bank of the United States, a government bank modeled on the Bank of England. It was destroyed by the Jeffersonians in the 1800s. The Jeffersonians then had second thoughts after the War of 1812, made it very difficult for the federal government to raise money against when fighting the British Empire. So they created a second Bank of the United States, which was failed to be rechartered. The recharter was vetoed by President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, claiming it was a monster bank. It was controlled by the Northeastern rich and so on for populist grounds. But so that was the national banking system took the form of the Bank of the United States. The third part, the federal support for national infrastructure, Gallatin came up with this truly visionary vision of, this was before the steam locomotive had really been developed. So it was, as the report says, roads, canals, harbors, and rivers, and we'll see a picture of that in a minute. This is the central figure of the American developmental state in the 19th century, Henry Clay, who was the long-serving senator from Kentucky, failed presidential candidate, the mastermind of the Whig Party. And if you wonder where that came from, in 18th century Britain, the factions were known as Whigs and Tories, which were named affectionately after rival bands of Scottish gangsters. So it's kind of like the Crips and the Bloods becoming British parties and American parties, if you're curious where Whig came from. But the Whigs tended to be the business class. They were the more nationally minded people in the South as well as the North. They wanted this program of government-business collaboration. They weren't necessarily progressive or liberal, although since they were based in the North, they tended to push back against the Southern slave owners. So they wanted this national developmental state that would invest in building out federally financing infrastructure, in promoting American industry, and in having a sound banking system so you don't have constant banking panics. This is Clay's most famous statement in defense of the American system. I won't go through all of this, but you'll note he says, the policy we have been considering ought to continue to be regarded as the genuine American system, that the free trade system, which is proposed as its substitute, ought really to be considered as the British colonial system. And finally, that the substitution of the British colonial system for the American system would subject us to a foreign legislation regarded by foreign interests, leading to ultimate ruin. So you really have to think of the United States in the 19th century as kind of like the African and Middle Eastern countries after decolonization in following World War II. That is, there's this deep resentment towards the former metropole, this desire to catch up and be equal, and this fear of what in the post-World War II period was called economic neocolonialism. So even though you've achieved your political independence, you're still completely subordinated to the industries and the capitalists in the former mother country, Britain in this case. Well, what happened, as we know, was that the US in its first version was a failure. It didn't really come together. The federal government was paralyzed by this North-South rivalry, which was not simply over chattel slavery, but it was over exports, over economics, tariffs, many other things. So the South was perfectly content with being, and the South, by the South I mean the rich white slave owners in the South, because they ran everything. It was an oligarchy. The Southern oligarchy was perfectly content with the US being a resource colony of the newly industrial British Empire. That is, we would buy our manufacturers from Britain and also from continental Europe later. We would send them raw materials, which the most important was cotton. For the textile mills of Britain, clothing was the first great mass-produced industrial trade, and the British had a near monopoly of it in the middle of the 19th century. So the only infrastructure the Southern planters wanted was enough to get the cotton bales. They were in favor of harbors and ports because you had to ship the cotton to New York, and then it was transshipped to Liverpool, and then unloaded in Liverpool, and it went to the textile mills of the British industrial Midlands. Beyond that, roads, we don't care, right? Public education, who needs it, right? We're a staple-producing, commodity-exporting society. So the Hamiltonian Henry Clay system was put forth largely by state governments in the northern states. They had a completely different vision of the future of the US. It would compete against the economy of industrial Britain rather than complementing it as a resource colony. It's based on import substitution and infant industries. And this is an essential point. You would have a home market of prosperous Midwestern farmers. Now, why is that important? Well, it's because if you want to have mass-produced national industries, you would rather have the consumers be a prosperous middle class who will buy your goods and your machines and so on and use them like farmers in the first instance, than a small little oligarchy who are so rich they don't care about buying factory goods. They can import, boutique or bespoke goods from other countries. And so we can talk about this later, but one of the arguments in development economics, and my hosts can contradict me if I'm misstating this, is that having too great a concentration of income can retard your mass production industries because you get a dual economy. So that's kind of what happened in the South. The North puts through the developmental state in just a few ways that they did it. Paterson, New Jersey, during the Revolutionary War, General Washington and Hamilton and his other aides camped by the waterfalls of the Passaic River. So years later, Hamilton remembered this. So he tried to get this through Congress, didn't work. So he got New Jersey to charter an industrial city built from scratch, Paterson, New Jersey. It was actually like a modern tech campus using the water power of the Passaic River. And it became a great success. Initially, like a lot of startups, it failed and was reorganized and went bankrupt. From the 19th to the 20th century, Paterson became the center of the textile industry in the United States, and particularly silk textiles. It helped develop early submarines, played a role in early aviation. It was only after World War II that it kind of fell into dereliction. So, that's one aspect of the Hamiltonian program. This is Albert Gallatin's infrastructure plan, which Congress took one look at and forgot about. But you see how ambitious it is. You have the National Road, which still exists. It's basically the I-95 and the Acela route, connected by various canals here and there. Most of this in the north ended up being constructed not with federal money, but with state money. And the most important was the Erie Canal, which is the backbone of American industry. Because what it did was, it also turned New York City from one of several important port cities, including Baltimore and Alexandria and Arlington, into the dominant commercial metropolis of the United States. By connecting the Great Lakes and the East Coast, you connected, you had this whole wave of manufacturing industries grew up along it and then spread out into the upper Midwest. And at the same time, because these Midwestern territories had banned slavery, they were free states, the land was divided into small farms rather than giant plantations. So you got this flourishing agrarian home market in the Midwest for the northeastern, Midwestern manufacturing industries. So this to this day, this is the industrial core of the United States. It's been supplemented somewhat by manufacturing zones in the South and the Ozarks and Appalachia and my native Texas, but this remains the core. This brings us to Abraham Lincoln. 1832, in his 20s, he ran for the Illinois state legislature. He was a Southerner, like Clay, but they both rebelled against the political elite in their region, and they supported this national industrial system. He said, "My politics are short and sweet like the old woman's dance. I am in favor of a national bank. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments and political principles. If elected, I shall be thankful. If not, it will all be the same." He was elected. And then when he became president, he told an acquaintance, "I have always been an old line Henry Clay Whig." And while fighting the Civil War, he worked with the Northern majority in Congress to push through all of this legislation for transcontinental railroads, for land grant universities. This is where federal land was sold to support agricultural and mechanical universities like Texas A&M. These were not new ideas. They had been bottled up from the 1830s, from the Henry Clay period, by the Southern slave owner class. Now, when the South seceded, the Southern senators and members of Congress all left. So suddenly there was a majority of Northern Democrats and Northern Republicans. So there was this floodgate of legislation, which led to what I call the Second American System, from 1861 to 1932. General purpose technologies, this is a term used by economists in the Schumpeterian school, the school of Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist taught here at Harvard from the 1920s until the 1950s, or 40s, late 40s maybe. The idea is that technology does not improve incrementally, that there are a few major technologies, GPTs, general purpose technologies, like the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, the transistor, which they create a new techno-economic paradigm, to use the Schumpeterian term. And then this means all the existing industries have to be rebuilt on the basis of these new technologies. So the general purpose technologies of the Lincoln era were steam-powered factories, steam-powered locomotives, steam-powered steamships, and telegraphy. Because of the lack of Southern opposition in Congress, they pushed through this high tariff import substitution plan. And the US had among the highest tariffs in the world all the way up until 1945, and to catch up with industrial Britain and the industrializing countries of Western Europe. You had the agrarian home market through the Homestead Act, which gave, all of this was part of this white apartheid society. It was designed to create a mass white middle class. So, we can talk about the race and gender aspects of this, but the idea was to give white yeoman farmers farms carved out of federal land, rather than giving them to gigantic estates, right? So you don't recreate this Southern problem of this agrarian oligarchy. Infrastructure, railroads and telegraphy, financial policy. The Second Bank of the United States, as I mentioned earlier, had been abolished in the 1830s by President Andrew Jackson. It was not revived, but they did try to kill off the state banks by creating a new system of chartered national banks. Fortunately or unfortunately, the state banks did not die. So to this day, there are two completely separate systems of bank charter in the US. And if you ever wonder if you see First National Bank of Boston or what, well, I'm just making this up, that's what it means. It's a national bank, it's not a state bank. And one more little tidbit, the Secretary of State for President Lincoln was a William Seward of Massachusetts, who had run against Lincoln for the presidency. His law partner, Erasmus Pershing Smith, was sent as a US diplomat to Japan, where he persuaded the Japanese government during the Meiji Restoration, during their modernizing period, to ignore the British and all of their free trade, free market theories, to follow the American system of protecting your infant industries. And he succeeded. And he became so popular there, supporting this Japanese import substitution policy, economic nationalism, that he insisted he had given up his American citizenship and became a Japanese subject of the emperor and went around in samurai robes and had a sword. And he's kind of eccentric. He invented the word telegram. There's a dispute about like telegraphic message. He did a telegram. So E. Pershing Smith, let's not forget him. Okay, third American system, 1930s, I argue up until 1989. It's all kind of arbitrary. But you really did have a new techno-economic paradigm in the 20th century of general purpose technologies, automobility, aviation, electricity, telephony, radio, television, and the US economy and others had to be transformed and rebuilt on the basis of these new technologies, mainly by the private sector, but also you had to have government action, as we'll see in a few minutes. The industrial policy was no longer tariff-based import substitution, because by 1900, the US had surpassed Britain as the largest manufacturing power in the world. And at that point, according to this Hamiltonian, it's Friedrich List theory, we can talk about this later, when you're catching up, you want to have training wheels in the form of infant industry protection. Once you've caught up and you have world-class industries, then you don't need to be protected anymore. What you want is to enlarge your foreign markets. But you want to do so on the basis of reciprocal trade. So they liberalize their market to your companies, you liberalize it to theirs. So already by McKinley and Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, in the 1900s, there's a move towards liberalizing American trade. The problem with import substitution strategies is that the protected industries don't like getting rid of the protections. So it really took all the way up until 1934, when a largely Southern coalition, the New Deal Democrats, took power of Congress, the Lincoln to Hoover Republicans having been discredited by the Great Depression, that you get this shift towards trade liberalization, which took the form of the Reciprocal Trade Act of 1934, which shifted the power for setting tariffs from Congress to the presidency. So that's why we have a US trade representative. That's why the president can levy tariffs or remove them. It goes back to Franklin Roosevelt. That was one of his first reforms. And the goal was not to have one-way trade, but to have reciprocal trade with other industrial countries so that you can have pooled markets and exploit the benefits of scale. State capitalism, radio, airmail, I'll get into that in a minute, infrastructure, rural electrification, interstate highway system, universal telephone access. It's not enough when you have a general purpose technology like a locomotive or an automobile. You have to have the infrastructure, the networks and the grids so that they're useful, right? I mean, you know, having cars but not roads is kind of useless. You know, having railroads without telegraphs so you can announce times and delays and things like that. So infrastructure has always been part of developmental state policy. Finally, financial policy, and you'll recognize a lot of this because we're getting closer to the present. You get, the Federal Reserve was a little earlier in the World War I era. Wall Street regulation, financial repression, a term I love, it just meant government artificially controlling interest rates for economic development reasons, favoring some areas rather than others. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was new. This lasted from 1932. It was created under President Hoover, but really expanded under President Roosevelt. It was a policy bank, as they're known now in China and Latin America and so on. It's a state capitalism. It's a public investment bank, which can be used for various purposes. Initially, it was to save failing businesses in the 30s. Then in World War II, the RFC was in charge of financing war production. And then it helped finance the Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II. And a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans killed it in 1957 because it was socialist. But so that was one of the tools. Okay, this is one of my favorite stories. How many people have heard of RCA? This was for us older types. Yeah, so the Radio Corporation of America, with their famous little dog listening to the gramophone. This was an invention of the Wilson administration during and after World War I, because the British Broadcasting Company had the Marconi patents, the patents of Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian scientist who devised or perfected radio. Lots of people worked on it. So the US was dependent during World War I on the British International Wireless, as they called it, network. And for strategic reasons, the US, it had moved towards an alliance with Britain against Germany by that point. But, you know, we wanted an independent radio system in the same way that the Europeans today don't want to rely completely on GPS. They have their own, you know, a separate satellite system they use. So Wilson ordered, and you'll see his name pop up again and again, a graduate of Harvard, where he was a Republican, by the way. He only became a Democrat later. Young Franklin Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but he's basically running it because his boss, Josephus Daniels, was an idiot. He's just like a Congress type who had no idea what FDR was really doing behind his back. So Wilson got young FDR. He said, get money from the Navy Department and create an American radio company. So he did. So they got the admirals to give over the money. They brought together various industrialists, and they created the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, national champion. In the 1920s, it was subjected to antitrust lawsuits. So they broke it up into 3 networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Okay, but all of this was spawned by this World War I era Wilson FDR created national government company. That's the developmental state. Airmail. The Wright brothers had the first working aircraft, heavier than air, but the US rapidly fell behind Britain and France and Germany because they saw the military utility of airplanes. So the militaries in Europe were just funding aviation massively because this was still a civilian society, very liberal, small L, free market, anti-government. Washington policymakers who wanted to build up an American aviation industry had to figure out some way to come across the opposition in Congress to this. So they invented airmail, which was a subsidy to airlines which carried mail, okay? And they arranged it so that if your plane had 1 letter in it, you got this subsidy, right? It was a total scam from the taxpayer's point of view. And it was a more or less, it would be denounced as corrupt crony capitalism today. But it created an American domestic aviation industry in the 1920s. So to have a developmental state in the United States, you gotta, you know, kind of be ruthless and tricky. This is what I like to call FDR's interstate highway plan. Everyone always says Eisenhower's interstate highway plan. Well, it's true it was passed under President Eisenhower, and it's true that he only managed to get it through Congress by saying, in the case of war, atomic war with Russia, we would have to rush tanks back and forth from California to New York and so on. And Eisenhower's genius as a former commander of the D-Day operation, and you know, the overlord in Europe, was to put the 2 words national defense in front of interstate highway system. So the act that created it in the 1950s was the National Defense and Interstate Highway System. Now, poor FDR, during his 4 terms as president, on at least to my knowledge, 4 separate occasions, had pushed for this to be created under Congress, but he didn't call it national defense, so it didn't go anywhere. But it was essentially, it wasn't his idea. It had been percolating around, for 20 or 30 years. This is actually a map he drew where he thought the highway should be. So FDR had a finger in a lot of these things. This is Vannevar Bush. He always said rhymes with beaver. It's not Vannevar, it's Vannevar. Distinguished career as a scientific bureaucrat at MIT, the Carnegie Institution. Most important, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, where he oversaw the development of atomic energy during the Manhattan Project. This is a new figure that you did not have in 19th century innovation, the scientific bureaucrat, and federal funding for basic R&D. So you see these tools of the developmental state, which in Abe Lincoln's time were tariffs, national infrastructure improvements, and national banking. You keep adding things like a policy bank, like the RFC in the 1930s. In the 1950s, the National Science Foundation, National Institutes for Health. And these become very important in the Fourth American System, which I, again, kind of arbitrarily, I say 1989 to present. This is Information and Communications Technology, ICT, is the basis of this latest wave, comparable to the introduction of the internal combustion engine and of the electricity and batteries a century ago. The industrial policy, and we can talk about this too, it's what's sometimes called hegemonic liberalism, because all of this, it kind of depends on the role that your country plays in the global order, right? So that the US had this protectionist system when it was a weak and poor ex-colony trying to catch up with Britain. During this period, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US, at least briefly, is a dominant world power and assumes it will hold this dominant position indefinitely. So you have offshoring of low value added production to military dependencies. There was an assumption in the 1990s that China would not challenge the US strategically or militarily, that it would be content, like West Germany and Japan, South Korea, to have the US police the South China Sea and keep peace globally. Government R&D, Pentagon, National Science Foundation, National Institutes for Health. The infrastructure, well, it's this, right? It's a wireless based on satellites and on wireless cells and wireless towers. Container shipping was important in order to have the massive expansion, not so much of trade, but of transnational production, because Professor Roderick can correct me if I'm mistaken, but about 1/3 to 1/2 of cross-border goods is intermediate inputs, right?
More.
How much of it?
More.
More, okay, so maybe the majority. It's components going back and forth. And a lot of this, most trade is still based on water, because water shipping is much cheaper than overland, even in the 21st century. Financial policy, we have enhanced Federal Reserve power and enhanced independence of central banks, both in the US and in Europe and in Japan, where they get into roles in policy making that they did not have before, as we saw during the Great Recession. Deregulation of finance from the 70s to the 90s. Venture capital is something new that was not really present in earlier American systems. I just have this quote in there for this number. Between 1958 and the early 1970s, the US federal government directly or indirectly funded between 40 and 45% of all industrial semiconductor R&D. So the ICT revolution was really nurtured during the Cold War by the Pentagon funding defense contractors and companies like IBM working for the Defense Department. And we have kind of a misleading vision of this. The incubation phase was not a matter of small startups and people in garages and so on. It was a matter of massive Pentagon funding for huge corporations, Bell Labs, IT&T, IBM. It's in this later phase of commercializing it, beginning in the 70s and 80s. That's where you get Bill Gates, you get Steve Jobs, you get the entrepreneurs. So we're getting close to the present. This is Branko Milanovic, his famous elephant curve. So it shows that as a result of globalization, mostly outshoring this intermediate input manufacturing, you get a significant rise in developing country incomes. But most of that's China, so it's not necessarily true of the developing country as a world. You get this crash among the first world American European industrial working class in their incomes, and then you get enormous profits for the investors and the managers and the CEOs and the business service professionals in the developed world. And one can argue the result is this. The elephant curve has led, in the hollowing out, this kind of hourglass economy has led to enormous anger on both sides of the spectrum. The economist David Autor did a study showing that counties in the US that were subject to the most Chinese import competition in the 2000s were the most likely to go for Sanders or for Trump, as opposed to the more mainstream members of their party. So there's a lot of anger out there. Last slide, Fifth American System. What is it? I don't know. We shall see. Some of you may help to create it or its equivalents abroad. Just some speculations here for conversation. Possible general purpose technologies, artificial intelligence, biotech, new materials, energy, who knows? All of these are in the loop, but some of them may pan out, some may not. Industrial policy, my guess is we will see a partial revival of economic nationalism, and because we're moving from this unipolar post-Cold War world to what in military and strategic terms looks more and more like a bipolar system, not perfectly matched, but with China as the other geopolitical pole of the international system, with its ambitions colliding with those of the United States. And if that's the case, that means that a lot of trade and investment decisions are going to inevitably be shaped by geopolitical, military, national security considerations, as they have been all throughout history. Infrastructure, I think it's safe to say the Internet of Things, using 5G technologies and successive iterations, allowing much greater communication among devices. But beyond that, your guess is as good as mine. Financial policy. Policy banks, I think, may make a comeback. The US recently, the Trump administration has a kind of a small policy bank for Africa being driven by competition with a lending institution with Chinese lending. So, but this is the future. And what was the Yogi Berra line? Prediction is difficult, especially about the future. So with that, thank you.
You want to start?
Thank you. This was a revolutionary account of the history of the United States. And an enormous instigation to formulating the doctrine of a developmental state. A task that we cannot subcontract to Friedrich List. So that's what I now want to do as another provocation to our conversations, to formulate the rudiments of a doctrine of the developmental state inspired by your historical account in the form of 7 theses. So the first couple of theses,
Give me a piece of paper.
the first couple of theses have to do with the requirements for the active integration of the national economy in the world economy. By active integration, I mean the integration on terms that preserve the space for rebellious national development, as you suggested the Americans did throughout their history. So the first thesis has to do with protectionism. And in protectionism, the relation of selectivity to politics and democracy. So protection is sometimes useful and sometimes not. It's circumstantial, depending not just on the circumstances of the national economy, but on its specific relation with the economies with which it's trading. So for example, one rule of thumb would be that free trade is likely to be most useful in two situations. Either when the trading economies are more or less at the same level of development, or when there is a vast difference of development between the trading economies. And is likely to be most dangerous when there is a difference, but the lower economy is within striking distance of the higher economy. That's the circumstance in which the case for protection is likely to be strongest. But protection is a species of selectivity, like differential exchange policies or differential interest rates for different parts of the economy. And always the problem of selectivity is that it can become a channel for either manipulation by interest, capture, not capture in the narrow regulatory sense, but capture in the broad sense of invidious class interest, and for dogma. So the fertility of a selective policy, like selective protectionism, is likely to depend on the political circumstances. So all the democracies that exist in the world now are weak democracies. They perpetuate impasse. They maintain political society at a low level of mobilization, and they perpetuate the dependence of change on crisis. And in weak democracy, capture of the state by sectarian class interests is favored. The alternative is authoritarian hard state, controlled by a despotic elite that claims to speak in the service of the national interest. But then selectivity becomes hostage to its interest in preserving its power and to the dogmas to which it is tied. So what's the general line of the solution? The deepening of democracy, the radicalization of democracy would be the condition to increase the chance that this indispensable selectivity that protectionism requires would be fertile. Now we come to the second thesis, which also has to do with active integration into the world economy. The shield of national rebellion. The country has to be able to rebel, to develop its national development strategy through a strong national project. I understand that a strong national project is a project that mobilizes the physical, economic, financial, and human resources of the nation and takes a distinct institutional expression. What we've discussed here in the course is a subset of those strong national projects, progressive subset. But to have such a project, you need to have a shield so that the government and the country are not on their knees, and particularly not on their knees in the need to obtain financial confidence by international capital. So what's the shield? The shield consists in part on a high level of domestic saving, and in part for countries that cannot borrow in their own currency, on a high and costly level of reserves in hard currencies. Now we know that when the progressives lost their faith in Marxism and in statism, they often took refuge in vulgar Keynesianism and its idea of counter-cyclical management of the economy. But this requirement of insisting on the fiscal shield trumps the arguments in favor of counter-cyclical management of the economy.
Well, also modern monetary theory.
Yes, of course, which is a radical,
Fad of the day.
which is a radicalization
Right.
of the fascination with cheap money, the residual growth strategy of the United States. So that's what would have to come first, the shield to be able to rebel. And the background of this thesis is the conviction that in history, rebellion is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. And therefore, a confused and bungling resistance is to be preferred to a clever and clear-sighted prostration. Now we come to the next pair of theses about the doctrinal content of the idea of the developmental state. And this pair of theses is about the internal core, to which the relation to the world economy is subordinate. So the third thesis is that for there to be such a strong national project, two kinds of initiatives must be combined. And to some extent, they were combined in what you call the first American system. So the first element is there has to be this large-scale mobilization of national resources, orchestrated by a nation-building elite. That was the Hamiltonian project, as you have described it. But this element would not achieve its effect were it not combined with a second element. And the second element is the selective democratization of opportunities of economic access in the crucial sectors of the economy, which were at that time in the United States, agriculture and finance.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't come from Hamilton. It came from these other elements in American
Right.
history. And it was that virtuous combination that accounts in great part for the building of the United States in the first half of the 19th century. And the second element has as its analytical premise that a market economy has no single natural and necessary form. Unfortunately, the Americans failed to develop this idea, although they practiced it in fragmentary form. And the absence of an adequate theoretical representation, as well as the proto-democratic liberalism enshrined in the Constitution, help account for the subsequent waning of this virtuous combination. Now we come to the fourth thesis, which also has to do with the internal core of the idea of the developmental state. The fourth thesis is that in this project of national rebellion, a crucial role is likely to be played by the way in which the state organizes the access of a large part of the firms and of the population to the most advanced practice of production. In the 19th century, the most advanced practice of production was mechanized manufacturing that then became Fordist mass production. Now, the most advanced practice of production is what we call the knowledge economy that we've been discussing during the semester. And because the knowledge economy depends on very demanding educational and institutional requirements to deepen and to spread, this activity of the state must be all the more penetrating. That is, the state must change the framework in order to create a framework hospitable to the deepening and dissemination of the now most advanced practice of production, and the ideas that prevail in the United States are hostile to this reinvention of the legal and institutional form of the market economy. Now we come to the next pair of theses, the fifth and the sixth, that have to do specifically with the role of the state at a more abstract level. The fifth thesis is that the role of the state as the reshaper of the legal and institutional form of the market economy is more important than the role of the state as a producer. So many economists have pointed out the significance of the productive involvement of the state, for example, through the development of the defense complex. We had here as one of our guests, Maria Mazzucato, for example, whose work is in part devoted to that theme. But this role, although it is important, is less important than the role of the state in innovating in the legal and institutional arrangements of the market economy. That's the most important role, as the previous discussion illustrates. Now we come to the sixth thesis. The sixth thesis is that the state that is capable of doing this work today in the conditions of the market economy does not yet exist. It has to be created. Because what we have in general by way of public administration in the United States and the world is the administrative counterpart to Fordist mass production. It's what you could call administrative Fordism. So for example, it is in the realm of public services, the provision of low quality standardized public services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, meaning services of lower quality than the analogous services that could be bought on the market by people who have money. And the only alternative to that appears to be the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. The state would have to organize civil society, not for profit, for civil society, to partner with the state in the competitive and experimental provision of public services. And moreover, the whole conception of the rule of law would have to change so that the state would be able to experiment and not to deal only on a take it or leave it, all or nothing basis. It would have to be able to try things out in particular domains before it universalizes the proposed solutions. So administrative experimentalism would be the indispensable substitute for administrative Fordism. Now we come to the seventh and last thesis. And the seventh thesis has to do with the reshaping and reinterpretation of nationalism as the moral and social background to these transformations. National rebellion has as its indispensable requirement national cohesion, and therefore the question of how we are to understand and develop nationalism. Now, all the nations of the world, or many of the nations of the world, are somewhere in a spectrum in the evolution of nationalism, from nationalism as a real or imagined tribe based on ethnic and cultural homogeneity, to nationalism as a form of moral specialization within humanity, a distinct way of organizing society expressed in distinct institutions, a different way of being human. Nationalism based simply on abstractions and ideas, so-called creedal nationalism, is not for real. It's a fantasy. The only real alternative to the tribal idea is the multiplication of forms of collective action, people doing things together, not just in politics or in the market, but in civil society, outside both the market and politics. Now, in this passage, from the nation as tribe to the nation as moral specialization with humanity, an accident occurs. The different nations of the world emulate one another. They eviscerate part of the content of their customs in order to prosper in the world. And then we have this unique phenomenon of the nations becoming more similar to one another even as their desire to be different is inflamed. So the impotent rage to difference in the presence of the waning of actual difference. The impotent wage will to difference, unlike actual difference, is not susceptible to compromise because there's nothing to compromise. It's not tangible. It can be only the object of an intransigent faith. To this poisonous character of contemporary nationalism, there are then two responses. One is the response of liberal cosmopolitanism, which says suppress the will to difference. And the other is the response of radical democracy and experimentalism, which says equip the will to difference by experimentalist economic and political institutions that allow the nations to create new difference. So difference is not the problem, it's the solution, and the differences that matter are less the ones that have been inherited than the ones that will be created. These 7 theses represent a proposal of the rudiments of a doctrine of the developmental state in the present circumstance for the United States and for the world.
Professor Roderick.
Well, so I'm struck by how concrete your story was and how abstract
Yes, of course.
Roberto's is.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in
You know, I
exploring.
believe only in universalizing heresies, not in local. So I must give the heretical doctrines a universalizing form.
But one of our sub-themes is always been how do you go from one to the other?
Yes, of course.
Right? So that's
course.
and I think that's
Of course. But you
the
need the-
territory that
You
would
need the
be
guidance of doctrine.
would be
And I think one of the weaknesses of the United States, I said that in my brief account, is that the Americans did all these experiments, but did not provide an adequate doctrinal expression. So you mentioned List, and List is an inadequate expression of these ideas as we must have them today.
Well, as an American, I'm not supposed to say this, but we've essentially lagged other countries in almost all of our reforms and our ideas. You know, whether it was the British Empire abolished slavery in the 1830s, right? It took us a civil war. Hamilton, with this American developmental project, is recycling ideas from the French Empire and the British Empire. Bank of the United States is modeled on the British Bank. It's modeled on the Netherlands model, which was modeled, and Roberto spoke on, touched about this, the copycat element. So the United States, we claim we're terribly creative. My view of the U.S. is, and I say this, as a moderate patriot, is that we took systems that had worked already, and they'd been proven in national monarchies and smaller countries, and applied it on a massive scale. And to some degree, China's doing this now. India, if it's successful, will do this. But as Roberto, as Professor Unger points out, that means that you didn't ever have to think this through yourself, right? You're just kind of borrowing these institutions. Often you're borrowing them, like with my RCA example, in wartime or under the pressure of some kind of geopolitical constraint or Great Depression, and there's even less time to work out any kind of coherent philosophy. So I think Professor Unger's onto something with the lack of a doctrine. I remember a friend of mine who was a German jurist visiting Washington, D.C., and he very, very, I know this sounds like a stereotype, very rigorous and Teutonic. He said, well, I want to see some American law books. So I took him to the Georgetown University co-op and showed him the law. So he says, where are the systematics of American federalism? And I said, well, I don't think there are any. There's a couple of opinions by Justice Marshall, and then there's, some Merriam and Willoughby in the 1930s and so on. And so he immediately concluded that I had no idea what I was talking about there. So for example, Germany in the 19th century distinguished between a Bundesstaat and a Statusbund. between a state confederation and a confederation of states. Now, this is totally alien, I should say, to the Anglo-American mind as well as the, this is a continental approach.
Yes, but Michael, to be fair to the United States, we have to remember a principle enunciated by a countryman of Friedrich List, Friedrich Schlegel, who said, two things are fatal to the mind. One is to have a system, and the other is not to have it. We have to combine.
But is it that the United, I mean, so is it that the US has lacked a doctrine, and then sort of all of these innovations or practices you've described under the heading of developmental state has been sort of practical, pragmatic responses to challenges at the time? Or is it, in a way, I mean, the US paradox is deeper because the US does have on the face of it, a doctrine that actually, totally violates these practices, because the U.S. faith in a kind of a free market system and the lone individualist inventor and the business person who's sort of decentralized in a decentralized fashion comes up with.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
A faith that the Americans have known how to put in its place when they needed to. And the most spectacular example was the war economy in the middle of the 20th century, when they discarded, as if it were a mask, all of these sacrosanct doctrines and ran the economy on totally different principles with spectacular effect.
But I think that exception is recognized because war is an exceptional
Yes,
period.
yes, but they
But
were
the
able to do it.
exception that is-
Well, okay. And then they quarantined this example as if it had no relevance to the running of the peacetime economy.
Well, I spent 30 years in Washington, and the thing that struck me is the extent to which what my old correspondent Gore Vidal called the United States of amnesia is a reality. That is, what was done and discussed 20 or 30 years ago is just erased by much of the policy world and the intellectual community. I think part of it, the academic world, because we have these Germanic-inspired research universities, you progress by overthrowing everything before you, right? So there's not this continuous tradition. Politically, you always want the new big idea. I've been commissioned by a national newspaper to make fun of this, the idea that every presidential candidate is going to come up with their own brand new program, and this will appear next few weeks. But the deeper question that I've come to in my old age is there a United States, or are there just elite and voter coalitions which happen to control the instruments of power at any given moment? And as my point about the rival American systems before the Civil War, now they each claimed it was in the national interest of the United States, right? So one claimed that state-sponsored industrialization would benefit everybody. The Southern planters had allies all through the North, among merchants who didn't like tariffs, among retailers, among the free family farmers, and they wanted the U.S. to be an agrarian, non-industrial country. So we can have opinions about this. Even the same elite, now see, this is really interesting. The same elite can change its strategy at different decades. So the Wharton School of Business was founded by Joseph Wharton, who was a Pittsburgh industrialist of the Civil War era, when all the industrialists supported high tariffs to protect American manufacturing from British import competition. In the charter of the Wharton School, it says this is a protectionist school. It shall only hire economists who teach protectionism, right? None of these British free trade economists. By the 1900s, the American manufacturers wanted to dump tariffs and move towards, expand foreign markets. So the last protectionists were purged by the regents from the Wharton School, which had been founded 30, 40 years earlier as an avowed protectionist school, because the same group of Pittsburgh manufacturers now had different interests. Yeah. So that's, I don't know, I'm agnostic about this, right? My natural instinct, I think, everybody's is to say there's this national interest, and we can identify it, and then map out ways to, now you have to mobilize coalitions to support it, But sometimes I'm just very agnostic, and you know, it depends on what gang is in power. And then you pick a gang, right? You don't necessarily pick a system.
So
Yes,
to-
but
to-
one of the advantages of ideas is it makes you less dependent on gangs.
Yeah,
In
as
the
long
long
as you can
term,
answer
we
the
hope.
question, you and whose army?
So two questions to follow up on that. So, I mean, you brought the discussion, I think appropriately, to the question of, so what's the political constellation of interest? Because each one of these, you know, behind each one of these American systems, there was a particular constellation of interests. And so one question is, so as we move on to this sort of the new system, or a system that might be more inclusive than the one that precedes it, what kind of alliance of political interest would that require? And do you see this playing out in the US context? I guess that'll bring us maybe a little bit to your
My
new
penultimate
book.
slide also,
Yes.
with Trump and Sanders. Well, in a nutshell, you can say if you look at the New Deal, World War II, Cold War system, all the way up until the end of the Cold War, maybe the 70s actually, it starts breaking down the 70s. You have a coalition, it's an internationalist coalition. It's what Thomas Ferguson, who has the investor theory of politics, talks about the international bloc that forms in the early 20th century, and it triumphs with Franklin Roosevelt and Eisenhower and the rest. And it says, okay, we're now the dominant superpower. You know, so we want free trade, even if it's unreciprocated, we don't care because we don't have anybody who can catch up with us in the near future, in the 50s and 60s. So we'll tolerate a certain amount of protectionism by our Japanese allies, South Koreans, Taiwanese, and others. It unites Wall Street investment bankers who want access to foreign, you know, liberalized finance. It unites the car companies, the multinational exporters, and it unites organized labor as long as the other industrial countries have not recovered from the damage of World War II, and the developing countries, the so-called third world, are still largely agrarian and complementary. As Professor Unger pointed out, you know, those are the ideal, it's the least conflictual trade. It's with other development countries and completely complementary economies. So this breaks down by the 70s when the Germans and Japanese catch up and start threatening American industry. In my new book, it's called The New Class War, comes out from Penguin in the fall. I argue that global labor arbitrage really blows up this coalition. By global labor arbitrage, I mean offshoring and to some degree immigration based on differential price of labor for workers who are doing the same tasks, right? And you've always had in the United States internal labor arbitrage in the form of what was called the runaway shop, that is internal offshoring from, say, high-wage New England to the low-wage South, or the scab, the strike breaker. Historically, the South served as the pool of low-wage labor, both white and black, that was brought up by Northeastern industrialists as used as strike breakers in Midwestern, Northeastern industrial conflicts. Now, the McKinsey Global Institute recently calculated that 43% of offshoring is based on labor arbitrage. That is, it's not based on, then that still leaves about half of global production, which simply reflects trade among high-wage nations and so on. It's by no means all of it. But that's a fairly large amount, and that is what is debated. So what you're seeing, I argue, in the United States and in Western Europe is this formerly privileged labor aristocracy, the white working class from the mid-20th century, not entirely white, I mean, African Americans, Latinos, and others, who were not facing import competition, and offshoring was really not a possibility until you had container ships and the internet and all of that, right? You did have conflicts over internal outsourcing from the Northeast and Midwest to the anti-union South. But you now have the same policy being applied across borders. So I think I agree with the project, your thesis, that you can't rewind and go back to the 1950s where a third of the population is unionized manufacturing workers in the Western world. On the other hand, if you have a increasingly polarized system where the formerly well-paid industrial workers and their children are being forced into low-wage, non-union, low-benefit jobs, whereas the college-educated are flourishing in, because of just economies of scale, right? I mean, a lot of these knowledge economy jobs are linked to the traded sector, right? Ultimately, you're an international lawyer, you're designing software, and you have, markets in many countries and things like that. So these are the folks who are doing well in the US and Western Europe. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I agree. I mean, you need to come up with a way of integrating these folks who were integrated in the past by two institutions, and I will annoy both the left and the right, because I say in Western Europe and in the US, the two institutions were the trade union, which will annoy the right, and the church, which will annoy the left. The churches, particularly Catholic churches, were very important in the labor movement and in the Christian Democrats in Western Europe and so on. And as the unions have been withered away or been crushed in the United States, congregational institutions have withered away in terms of membership. What you see, if you look at the high school educated Americans, using that as the definition of working class, there's just far less participation in other groups, and the power that they had through numbers that was magnified by these organizations has just diminished. And we've seen a shift in every area, in politics, in the workplace, in the culture, in the media, which is an important area, away from organized working class people to organized money and affluent people, and college educated people. Right?
So Michael, let me ask you, how do you see the opportunities and resources in the United States for movement in a direction like the direction that my 7 theses signal?
I think in the United States, less so than some other countries, but particularly the United States, there is always an enlightened member of what in my book I'm calling the overclass, the managerial, professional, capitalist elite, right, who want to do the right thing. It's hard for them to prevail with the other members of their elite unless there's some external compelling reason to do so, which has usually been international military or geoeconomic competition, or it is fear of revolt from below, right? But in the absence of, particularly because, well, in the United States, there was also intra-elite rivalry, which is disappearing now, and that's arguably bad for ordinary people. Because as long as there were these two regions that were battling to control Washington, D.C., the Southern elite, all the way up until the 20th century, allied itself with the proletariat in the Northeast and the Midwest, which was largely European immigrants. Particularly there was this Irish-American white ethnic working class coalition with the Democrats, and the elite Democrats, when the Southern elites dominated the Democratic Party. Because they were the common enemies. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if you have a country divided into two regions with different elites, the elite in each region wants to undermine its rival elite, right? By helping the proletariat, the other region. It's kind of schematic, but it explains a lot. Conversely, the allies of the northern industrialists historically in the South were not only African Americans who hated the local elites much worse than they hated Pittsburgh, manufacturers, but also the white poor in the Ozarks and Appalachia, who also often were allied with the Northern Party. I think what we're seeing in the U.S., in Britain, in Europe, is this the disappearance of regional differences and the formation of a purely national elite for the first time in American history. And an elite that's based in, half a dozen cities. This is one, right? In DC and New York and LA and San Francisco. Austin, where I am now, is the 11th biggest city in the US. And this is a totally new pattern in American history. It's familiar in Britain and France, where you had this overgrown capital and then this kind of depopulated surroundings. I think in Mexico and Brazil, correct me if I'm mistaken, but like Brazil, right? You have Sao Paulo and Rio, right? You know, Mexico City being the great, it's simultaneously economic, you know, political, cultural capital. And what this means is that the elite, non-elite distinction really kind of ossifies when you get to that pattern. So I think that this is something that that animates my my reading and thinking and writing now. If you look at,
But couldn't you say, Michael, in a more hopeful vein, that both right-wing and left-wing populism, because they lack a strong project with an institutional legacy, could be seen as interludes and opportunities for a project if a project arose?
well, yes and no. So if the project involves integrating working class people into power-sharing institutions, and they won't necessarily have to look like trade unions and churches in 1950, it can be something totally different, then that's positive, that's what you want, right? Because I'm not, the nightmare is you get this kind of technocratic neoliberal oligarchy in London and Paris and, you know, New York and DC and Austin for that matter. And then there's this great mass of people in the outer suburbs, usually the periphery, and they're not part of any institutions that represent them, and they're not represented in the mainstream parties. And so they turn to demagogues, right, who by their very nature cannot govern effectively because, you know, they don't represent institutions, and they don't have experts, and they don't have appointees, and they don't have all of these things. And this is the pattern I say in my book, in my native South, between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Revolution. It was controlled by a very small oligarchy, every southern state. Not only the entire African American population, but about half of the white population was excluded from voting by property tests and literacy tests and poll taxes, things like that. So essentially it was the southern gentry ran everything in its own interest. And then you got, you know, Big Bill Thompson and, you know, Big Jim Folsom, and we had a country music singer, was governor of Texas. We had Ma and Paul Ferguson, husband and wife governors of Texas, these populists. Huey Long, the most famous example. And it's a nightmare scenario when you oscillate between these two extremes. So I guess in contributing to your ongoing conversation, I would focus on the connective tissue, right, where you mobilize people, right, so that there's some, and this also solves.
And what's the connective tissue that exists or that could be brought into existence?
Well, I call it democratic corporatism in the book. Corporatism in the US now is an insult, meaning that you take corporate money or something, but I mean the political science sense. That is, corporatism was the theory going back to the 19th century that representative democracy by itself is not enough. That is, if you vote every 2 or 3 years, and then the rest of the time you spend your every day at work, your industry and your workplace is a complete despotism in which you have no say, right? And then what kind of democracy is that, right? You know, you're 40 hours a week, you're subject to your tyrant, your boss. So the corporatist vision was, it came in two strains, one authoritarian and one democratic. And the authoritarian one says you would replace elections altogether, territorial elections from districts, with corporate representation by guilds, right, and by industries. And that became the basis briefly of Mussolini's fascist system, various Latin American authoritarian regimes, Spain and Portugal. The democratic version you found in different ways in social democratic Europe, and to some degree in the United States in the 50s and 60s, where you either had government-based collective bargaining, or you had tripartite government, business, labor organizations, where you substituted the despotism of employers with bargaining, with labor, that was more or less compelled by the government. And there's a recent example of this, which I find promising, in spite of my pessimism. Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York is by no means a radical in any way. To deal with the problem of low wages in the fast food industry, he revived this archaic 1930s institution, the wage board. Wage boards were created in Britain and Europe in the early 1900s for what Winston Churchill, who was a supporter, called the sweated industries. These are industries that can't be organized for various reasons. So the wage board has elected representatives of labor, of employers, and maybe government, public interest consumers, and they work out benefits and wages rather than having a one-size-fits-all policy for the whole country, like a single minimum wage everywhere. So Cuomo revived this, and they had a $15 minimum wage in the fast food industry, which could not be effectively unionized. So one thing to think about is, as I say, I'm not saying go back to the 1950s. I don't think the American style of adversarial collective bargaining works, it never worked outside of a few concentrated industries, like mass production industries where a strike can shut everything down. It works today in hotels in Las Vegas. Did you know that? Because the threat of shutting it down during the tourist season means the casinos and the hotels cave in to labor pretty quickly. But in the kind of environment that I think we'll be moving into, something like wage boards. So this is not totally
So I
utopian.
think
They
that
already exist.
Yeah. So I think that the wage boards idea is interesting as an interesting example of the kinds of institutions that might constitute this connective tissue or build up what you've called democratic corporatism. Something else might be, I think, we've discussed examples of this, of a kind of collaborative
Extension.
business
Yeah.
and government interactions, iterative interactions
Yes.
that are designed to achieve a number of purposes, including the dissemination of advanced technologies to smaller and medium-sized enterprises, the expansion of the goods and productive jobs base.
So generically, this uplift of the periphery of the economy,
Yes.
where most people are.
That's right. But through the institutionalization
Yeah.
of these processes of collaboration between various agencies of the state and various segments of the private sector, including the most advanced firms. It is precisely, I think, the analog to the collective bargaining of the 50s and 60s, or the wage boards of some sort, which is that this notion that we have a certain number of social goals that we want to pursue. We do not decide ex ante what the outcome is
Right.
going to be, so it's not the typical kind of mode of regulation where there is an independent regulatory agency that sets the rules, and it's then up for the markets and the businesses to operate. But it's deliberately iterative, self-monitoring.
Well, the way corporatism historically has worked, and this is again democratic corporatism in post-1945 it was the threat of direct government legislation that compelled business and labor to negotiate, and labor is often reluctant, would prefer to negotiate rather than to take the risk of having a one-size-fits-all rule. So these things were set up so that, okay, we put labor and business in particular sectors together to work something out. Government will approve it. We'll do it ourselves if you can't come to, but you may not like what we come up with. And I've been, you may be interested in this, I've been talking to economist friends about this. And I want to know the literature about bargaining, because in public consciousness, there are three sectors. There's the private sector, where it's all the free market and doing all this stuff. Then there's the government where you pass a law and then it's imposed by law. There's this huge realm, both in the public utilities, which mostly have public utilities commissions, which are corporate, right? They have representatives of the business, of consumers, but also in the labor area with tripartite business, employer, labor, government, business, and labor. This is a realm of bargaining where the price of the electrical bill or of the wage is not set by equilibrium in the market, but it's also not determined by Congress.
There is a problem, Michael, which the historical roots of this idea suggest, which is the idea of a democratic corporatism in an American context would seem to me to harken back most tangibly to the early New Deal, because the
Right.
central institutional theme of the early New Deal was not the democratization of opportunities and capabilities, but the corporatist restabilization of the American economy. Orchestrated competition, concerted action between public and private. And because that was the last great moment of institutional foundation in the United States, the American progressives today are fascinated by the example of the New Deal. It seems to me to be a very defective and inadequate model for what could or should be done now. Because now the main theme should not be this corporatist restabilization. Maybe it shouldn't even have been then this theme. Those were the ideas that prevailed. It should be this enhancement of agency, of the opening up of the world of innovation and capabilities to a broader part of the population.
You have both. So if you look at the New Deal, the US was two countries. It was the industrial manufacturing core of the Northeast and the Midwest, and it was the rural and South and West. In 1900, the gap in per capita income between the American South and the American North was greater than between Victorian Britain and Russia. That's how poor the South was. So in my part of the world, Texas, the New Deal was roads, highways, agricultural extension programs. I think it's your diffusion of technology to catch up. In the old Northeastern industrial core, they had already achieved what they were going to achieve given those underlying technologies. There it was distributional. So I think you can do both at the same time. And to follow up on something Professor Roderick said, the United States has had one of the world's greatest systems for technological diffusion in agriculture,
Yes.
and one of the
Discussed
worst in manufacturing.
Yes.
Okay? And it's partly as the result of Vannevar Bush, who was great but misguided in various ways. So after the Civil War, the US created this incredibly enlightened system for modernizing and democratizing agriculture. It included the Homestead Act. It included federal subsidies through land grants, sales of federal land, for all of these state agricultural and mechanical colleges. It created the Agricultural Extension Service, which to this day is very important if any of you are familiar with rural America. The universities study the problems of family farmers. They then send the agricultural extension agents out to teach them new methods. The extension agents come back and tell the professors what the farmers are saying. And so consequently, the US had the most productive agriculture in the world and a home market.
We have repeatedly discussed this example as an inspiration.
How about how
for what
bad
can be done now.
how bad the industrial system is?
Yeah.
There was a proposal. Vannevar Bush's great opponent was a West Virginia member of Congress named Harley Kilgore, and he did not want a national science foundation that only made research grants to prestige professors in top Ivy League and private and state research universities. He wanted an industrial extension service, right? Where small businesses there would be an industrial extension agents. They would go back and forth with the practical academics, but they could not afford R&D, right? So when you have a small artisanal factory, something breaks, you don't have an R&D budget to figure this out, but you would be able to take it to the university. So Vannevar Bush's vision won, and it's had great successes with Silicon Valley and many other things. The genome, modern biomedicine. But consequently, we've neglected this other aspect. By the way, West Germany, after 1945, took the two institutions that Americans had invented and rejected. And this became partly the basis for their industrial success. One was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So after, when the United States announced the Marshall Plan to recapitalize German banks and German industry, the Germans said, well, we don't have any single agency that can do this. So they said, well, we have this thing called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Why don't you just do a German version of it? So they created the Kreditanstalt für Wiederbewegung, I think. Wiederaufbau. Okay, we have a German student. Which, correct me, that's literally Reconstruction Finance Corporation, right? It was taken from the New Dealers and created in Germany. To this day, it is so successful in capitalizing, you know, acting as this kind of state investment bank that it's opened branches now in New York and elsewhere. The United States killed it because this was a socialistic idea from the crazies around Franklin Roosevelt in the 50s. Congress killed it. The other one was this Industrial Extension Service, which, tell us, German student, what is it?
I didn't pay attention for the last sentence.
It works with small businesses in Germany to do their R&D.
Yeah.
Fraunhofer, yes, the Fraunhofer Institute, which works as an industrial extension agency. It's a nonprofit research institute which does R&D for Mittelstand, for small and medium businesses of the kind that Harley Kilgore envisioned. Is it Harley Kilgore? Maybe I'm getting the name wrong, but it was this congressman.
Michael, we should take some questions, but I know that there is a question that a lot of students are thinking about, so I'm going to pose it myself.
Sure.
So, I mean, our discussion has focused on the United States so far, and I often hear from the students the comment that, well, you know, this is fine for the United States, you know, has a long history of the, you know, developmental practice, is, you know, military might and huge country and big power, but there's no way in the world that any of this could possibly be relevant to a small developing country or even a large developing country like India, and where the choices are much more constricted. Partly because this question about state capacity, this nagging question that the state just doesn't have the capacity. And second, you know, that the options are much more constrained given where you are in the world economy. What would you say from, you know, the history of the United States experience here? Sort of what might you be able to say to a student like that?
Well, I've given a lot of thought to this in the context of scale. So the average independent state, nation state, or multinational state in the world today, which is a sovereign country represented in the General Assembly of the United Nations, has about 10 million people. That is, the vast majority of sovereign states are fairly small. The city of Los Angeles has 15 million people. It's bigger than any single Scandinavian country. So that's my long-winded way of saying, I think that if you're a small country, then you can learn from the economic development strategies of cities, and in some cases of states and federal subunits in these gigantic countries like the United States. Because the key difference, I think, you mentioned the governability part. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, if you have a total kleptocracy running your country, no system's gonna work. But you cannot rely as a small developing country on your internal market if it's small, right? By definition, you have to rely on some larger market. So you can do that as part of a bloc or federation. Maybe it's regional, or maybe you just have a niche within a larger open global economy like Singapore or Sweden or some of these other fairly small countries. The other thing is it makes no sense for you to have national champions, that is a single corporation you know, that is competitive on a global scale in industries that tend to be dominated by, because of economies of scale, by oligopoly, right? So Brazil has Embraer. Brazil's a very big populous country. You know, they have their own jet company. You know, Estonia is not going to have its own automobile industry, right? New Zealand did have one that was abolished. They had a very small, inefficient, protected. Now, so if that's the case, it makes sense for you to specialize in GVCs, global value chains, and you want to work your way up if possible. You don't do it overnight. And you're probably going to be doing deals the way American cities do in American states with existing global oligopolistic firms, most of which are based in North America, Western Europe, and East Asia. And your goal is not ever, if you're Estonia, to come up with, you know, a rival to Airbus and Boeing. You're just not going to do it. But it's to move up from the lower value added to the higher value added sectors within the traded sector of your economy, while coming up with some mechanism, which is another conversation, about how having a flourishing traded sector, that is goods that are, services that are traded in international commerce, how that wealth leaks or is transferred to the domestic non-traded sector, right? But so it is a challenge, and
But we know empirically, right, Danny, it can't be that small scale in itself is incompatible with the maintenance of advanced manufacturing, because we have an economy like Switzerland, which has one of the highest percentages of manufacturing in the world.
But it tends to be machine tools and precision goods and intermediate inputs. Yeah,
Their specialization.
yeah, that's right.
Okay. Comments, questions? Why don't you take your own questions, Michael?
Okay, yes, sir.
When talking about the fifth American system, you predicted new mechanics. My question is, how should we see this mechanics in the background of the globalization dilemma, as Stanley suggested?
Well, I think that if you go back to Professor Unger's talk about trade is least conflictual when you have countries that are at the same level, right?
Or totally different.
Or totally different, okay? So if they're the same level, then you can open up markets, and then one of the paradoxes of trade, and you must encounter this when you teach this, right, is that contrary to Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, most trade is not only between countries that are of the same income level, but largely in the same goods, right? We buy automobiles from Germany, we sell automobiles from Germany. We sell consumer electronics to Japan, we buy it from them. So, and then on the other hand, if it's completely complementary things like timber, you know, or rare earths, you know, as inputs into, you know, then you have that kind of complementary. I think what we see with the development of China, with the development of India, with the development of Africa down the line, is simply the fact that everybody wants to corner the market in the lucrative, high-value traded industries, which is something that only happens in an industrial civilization. That is, in the agrarian society, you could only grow to the point that your armies could conquer peasants and keep adding peasants and arable land. And then at some point, you just could not repress them anymore. It was just too big. In an industrial society, and this has been the conflict between these industrial nations from the 18th century onwards, one country can make all of the razor blades in the world if you have enough inputs and you know, the good factories, and machines can complement the lack of labor. One company can make all the cars. One country can make all of the airplanes. You see this in shipbuilding. Shipbuilding has always been a heavily subsidized industry. The United States only had it when we subsidized shipbuilding, civilian shipbuilding. From FDR to Reagan. Reagan abolished it, our shipbuilding collapsed. If you look at the last 30 years, Japan had about half of global shipbuilding. And then South Korea rose. And then now it's China. I think they're up to like half now, something like that. So that's the norm in a manufacturing economy. That is, once you've got this big productive factory, depending on global demand, you can just supply all of the global demand. Ultimately, for military reasons, if none others, the great powers, and here I'm talking about the 4 or 5 major military powers. Let's forget the 180 small countries in the General Assembly. The great powers, is like going back to Hamilton and Clay, are not going to want to be dependent on other great powers for their basics, what they need for the military, for their electronic infrastructure, and so on. And this is not because they're mean or selfish or plotting world domination, or it's imprudent, right? For the same reason why the Wilson administration created a separate radio industry. We were allied with the British. We could have continued to rely on them, but at the end of the day, we didn't want to have to ask London's permission, right? So I think there's conflict over these traded sectors, and they differ from time to, what they are. Steel has been one for 100 years, right? In order to be a manufacturing country, you have to have steel. One country can make all the steel for the world. That's very easy. But the other major powers are going to object to this. So you can do this nice, or you can do this not so nice. The nice way, I think, and this is why I would be kicked out of any economics department, would be to cut a deal among the major powers to share markets and say, okay, India, the EU, the US, Africa, they're going to get a quota for steel. I would be kicked out.
Market sharing agreement.
I would be
You
kicked
would
out.
be kicked out for sure.
The alternative is to say, oh, look, they're building up their steel industry just like we did. They're cheating, right? We must punish this. They're violating the laws of free trade, right? So they're aggressors. So that's the political dynamic that you get into with this. And that's why I call it neo-mercantilism. And I see it as a function not of aggression on the side of anybody, but simply the fact that you have these incumbent powers, industrial powers, the US and Europe and Japan, South Korea and Taiwan to some degree. And then you have rising powers. And just as the British were not too thrilled about the US development of its manufacturing capability in the 19th century, and the Germans and Japanese, there's going to be resistance to the rising industrializing nations from the incumbents.
So, I mean, to break it down specifically, because, I mean, most concretely, this issue arises in the context of U.S.-China.
Right.
And if so how is that likely to play out? I mean, one scenario which might connect with what we were discussing earlier is that the kind of the national managerial professional elite, which until recently viewed itself as part of not any domestic political coalition, but simply as part of this hyper-globalist network, where they didn't see their own interests or survival in any way linked with what was happening domestically. If trade tensions, in particular with China, continue and become inflamed, they could turn to a much greater degree nationalist, and might then view themselves as sort of pursuing a kind of a national strategy and a national coalition to support themselves.
But Denny, on that point, and this is a fundamental element of our discussion, for the Americans to reestablish a nationalist project, they have to replace their feet of clay by something more solid, because protectionism is not enough. They have to have a domestic productivist project. They don't have it yet.
Right, right.
And that's
I agree with that entirely, yeah. Yeah,
But the hopeful thing from Michael's presentation is that they'll find that you may not like this answer, but they'll find this in American history, because they'll just end up repeating or falling into a kind of practice of developmental state, which is nothing other than repeat of American economic history.
But the more it's just a repetition, the least likely it is to be successful. They'll have to reinvent it for it to be able to succeed, and that requires ideas.
Well, but you can copy it. I do think there, as you said, the countries copy it from each other. So if you look at the rise of the modern military, it was Prussia which developed the general staff, modern war colleges, all of these institutions. It's the most advanced country in the 19th century, which then became Imperial Germany. There was a big debate within the United States and Britain and so on. Do we keep our 18th century, local traditions, or do we copy the Germans? Little footnote in American history, there was an international convention against piracy signed by all of the Western European nations in the 1860s. The United States refused to sign, and the State Department sent a note. Do you know about this? So why do you know about this? It's so obscure.
Not this specific thing, but the U.S. was a well-known violator of all intellectual secrets.
Well, so, no, it wasn't intellectual property. So they said the U.S. Constitution grants Congress to authorize letters of marque and reprisal. Anybody know what marque and reprisal is?
Metaphorical piracy. It's literal
Actual piracy, literal piracy.
All right.
So what happened in the 18th and the 17th centuries was the King of France or the King of England would authorize pirates to attack the shipping of the rival empire during wartime and then call them off. So the United States hired pirates during the war against Britain to harass British shipping. Jean Lafitte, the great French pirate, whose base was on Galveston Island off of Texas, then it was part of Spain, was paid by the US government to harass the British with his pirates from his pirate nest in the Gulf of Mexico during the War of 1812. So in the 1860s, by the way, as the US tends to do with its allies, as soon as the war was over, they sent the Navy to bomb his pirate nest into smithereens, and he fled for his life, as like Noriega and Saddam and various Gaddafi. So in the 1860s, the U.S. says, if it were not for letters of marque and reprisal and our use of pirates in wartime, we would have to develop a standing navy, and that would be a threat to Republican liberty in the United States, because it would create a swollen government and a military caste, which made no sense even then, because historically it was standing armies that were thought to be the instrument of tyrants. It wasn't like admirals. What are they going to do? How are they going to occupy the country? So
You don't drive your ship to the capital.
But by the time the Japanese, following the German model, sink the Russian fleet, at that point you get Theodore Roosevelt and naval modernization. You get the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the German General Staff. So it's a long-winded way of answering. You copy what the current practice is. I'm not sure you have to develop it either from history or on a separate national.
Let's not, sort of completely overlook the possibility that they may look for good ideas too.
No comment.
Other questions?
One final comment or question?
This is a fabulous discussion. Because history is astonishing.
Yes.
You spoke about protectionism and tariffs at different historical moments in US history, and I was wondering, how do you perceive this current situation in which Donald Trump is exercising some sort of sui generis protectionism in the context of trade war with China?
Well, the current moment actually goes back to the 1970s. Trump didn't come out of nowhere. The political coalition in favor of free trade was breaking down because of European and Japanese competition, the beginning of offshoring, which was then to Mexico and Central America. China came much later. So essentially, organized labor broke and became more protectionist in the 70s and 80s and 90s. You also had the rise of Ross Perot. That's what all of this was about. Perot got as an independent candidate in 1992, and he ran on the threat of NAFTA and of imports from Mexican offshoring and so on. He got 19% of the vote. That was higher than any independent party candidate since Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 when he ran as a progressive. Trump in 2000 tried to take over Perot's Reform Party, which was this kind of populist economic nationalist party with a lot of industrial state support. Do you know about this? It's a fascinating story. So Trump and his friend, the wrestler Jesse Ventura, a TV wrestler, they knew each other through, as we say in Texas, through wrestling. So they tried to take over the Reform Party. Perot had given it up. Their enemies were Pat Buchanan, the right-wing commentator, and David Duke, the former Ku Klux Klan leader. So Trump and Ventura were kind of the moderates of the Reform Party. And they fought. Buchanan and Duke captured the machinery of Ross Perot's party. Ventura and Trump quit in disgust. Trump did a half-page letter in the New York Times denouncing the neo-Nazi Patrick Buchanan and the Klansman David Duke for taking over this Reform Party. Trump wrote a book at the time. I found a remaindered copy and read it like 20 years ago. It was very liberal. I mean, it was Canadian-style health insurance and because he'd been a Democrat in the Northeast. But so Jesse Ventura went and had a single unsuccessful term as governor of Minnesota, went from TV wrestling to governor. And Trump, we will see in 2020, 1 or 2 terms. But that constituency was there. And I think one of the reasons why everyone was caught by, so that's the real question is not